Welcome to HR Voices, a podcast for independent HR and people professionals and the businesses they support. HR Voices is brought to you by the expert team at HR Independence Limited. We hope you enjoy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of HR Voices podcast. I'm your host, Mary Asante, and with me here today, I've got the fantastic Liz Dewar. Hi, Liz.
Hi, Mary. How are you doing?
I'm all right, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Excellent. So Liz is joining me today as part of the series that we're doing, highlighting what HR consultants do, but also, more importantly, the value that we deliver to our clients. I will let Liz introduce herself in a minute, but just really wanted to say that we'll be focusing on resolving conflict in the workplace. That is through the lens of mediation, workplace investigation, and conflict coaching, because those are Liz's areas of specialism. So can you tell us a bit more about yourself, your background, and your company, HR?
Sure, thanks, Mary. So my background is in HR, and before setting up HR Think, which is my HR consultancy, I held a number of HR director positions, and in B2C and B2B actually, so a broad range of organisations. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, I decided that I would go out on my own, and I quickly realised that a lot of the work that I'd actually been doing as an HR director was very much about coaching and mediating situations, occasionally some investigation work, because obviously you will get grievances in the workplace being raised that need to be resolved, but a lot of coaching and mediating situations. And so in terms of my own HR consultancy, I was quite interested in that side of the HR arena. And so that's what I do now. I help organisations resolve conflict in the workplace. And it's interesting how we list the order in which we list the sort of services that I provide for a client. So we talk about mediation, we talk about investigations, and we talk about the coaching. And I even do it. I put that bit on the end. But in some ways, if we could coach people better to be able to manage situations in the workplace, possibly there wouldn't be a need for mediation or workplace investigations. But of course, that's in a perfect world, and we know the world isn't perfect. But yeah, so that's what I do now. I help organisations resolve conflict, and I much prefer trying to help organisations prevent grievances rather than having to be in a situation where they've got to be investigated. So, and when I take on a client who have a grievance that they want investigating, I will always ask them, have you thought about mediation? Because that might be something that's more productive in the long term than conducting an investigation. But yeah, so that's what I do.
Excellent. Thank you for that overview, Liz. And I think you've touched on a number of things that for probably most time people professionals listening to us, it makes absolute sense. But for business owners and then business leaders listening to us, may not necessarily make that much sense to them. So we touched on mediation, investigations, and coaching. And maybe we spend a little bit of time talking about what mediation is, what investigation is, and what coaching is. And we can start with coaching in terms of what does it actually mean, because coaching is a very broad brush word, isn't it? You have life coaches, you have business coaches, and all sorts of coaches. So what does it really mean in terms of HR or people consultancy?
Yeah. So the type of coaching that I provide would be to leaders or managers, anybody who either manages other people or has to work with other people. We find ourselves in the workplace now with 5 generations in the workplace. And I think if I look back over the changes in my career, when I started off at the tender age of 18 working, you didn't really speak out if you weren't happy with things, you just didn't say anything. Now people are much more vocal, which is a great thing. But we do have this sort of intergenerational situation where we've got lots of different views, people have got different values, different views, and the world of work is often conducted remotely with different technology, and that's got its upsides and its downsides. But it's a real situation where there is potential for conflict and disagreement and misunderstanding and different approaches. And in organizations, you do need a little bit of disagreement. And I always describe it as you need a little bit of grit in the oyster to make the pearl. Not everyone is going to agree with everybody. And that's a healthy thing most of the time. But when that conflict starts to become unhealthy, then that's where people sometimes need some help. And that can be done through coaching to help them navigate either difficult conversations that might need to be had, dealing with people that are different from them in terms of their differences of opinion or different styles of working. Often I hear people will say to me, oh, it's just a personality clash. They're just never ever going to get on. I'm not sure I believe that there's such a thing, but I think there's a lack of understanding of somebody else's perspective. So what I try to do through coaching is that, and it can be preventative. So it could be coaching to give people a sort of tool bag of skills that they can use at different times during their career to deal with situations, to stop them escalating. Or it could be that there's a situation where someone is really struggling being able to work with or manage somebody else. And so I give them some coaching in terms of tools to help them be able to navigate those conversations in a more productive way. So that's the sort of coaching that I, with my conflict label on.
Excellent. And I think the reality is that when you offer a diverse range of skills, when you are working with a client, you tend to pick sets of various skill sets from different areas of expertise, and then you pull them together, isn't it? Which is why invariably when you're talking about coaching, mediation came in quite a lot. But if we focus in on mediation itself, what might that look like for one of your clients when, let's say, coaching has worked, but not as quite, because we're dealing with human beings, and regardless of what we do, nothing ever goes to plan. When you think, oh, everything is sorted, sometimes something does come up. And so, what does coaching really mean, and how does it manifest itself when you're working with your clients?
Yeah, should we talk about mediation or coaching?
Sorry, mediation.
Yeah. So I think there's mediation with a small m, which is, I think if everybody could gain some mediation skills, the world would be a much better place. So there's that mediation with a small m. So there's a little bit about coaching to try and help people mediate situations. But as you say, sometimes that doesn't always work. And there is a requirement for a mediation with a big M as an intervention. So I think there's 2 situations where mediation can arise. There's been a situation that's been brewing and now it's come to a bit of a head. So we need to think about mediation. Or it could be somebody is or has raised a grievance, or they're nearly thinking about raising a grievance, and the organisation wants to head that off. So they might offer the parties mediation. Often when I am given one of those situations with a client, most conflict, and you can look at this sort of micro or macro in the world, most conflict is about loss. It's about an actual loss that's happened. So it could be loss of respect, loss of trust, or it could be a perceived loss that the person may be worried that's going to happen in the future. So what we're trying to find out in mediation is what that loss is and whether that's actual or not, and trying to get people to understand the other person's perspective. So when I mediate, there's typically two parties. Sometimes there can be more than one party, and I have run mediation for clients with a co-mediator where there's been multiple parties, anything up to five people being involved. But basically, if you look at it, that you've got two parties, that's probably the easier way to answer your question. So you've got two parties that are in this situation where there is a deadlock. And what I try to do is, first of all, seek agreement that they would like to go to mediation, because mediation is always voluntary. And I always say to people, you can step out of mediation anytime you like. There's no obligation. You're not supposed to do, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. So it must be voluntary. So I would speak to both parties to seek their agreement to mediate. And then I would explain the ground rules to them in terms of the confidentiality. I never reveal to the client what was discussed in mediation. There are a couple of exceptions to that, is if somebody was going to do something illegal or they had done something illegal, then I would need to reveal that, or if their life was in danger or their safety was in danger. But apart from that, they could tell me anything and it won't go back to the client. And I think sometimes when you're doing mediation in-house, my experience has been that people will often be a little reluctant maybe to speak to somebody in-house with a mediation role because they're worried that it's going to be discussed with other people. So if you use somebody independent, any good mediator will have that as sort of their standard practice. So I seek agreement, and if both parties agree, then we can go ahead and we would run the mediation. And the first thing is to really understand what each of the individual's situation is, what their truth is, because they've been living that. And my role isn't to agree, to decide who's right or wrong, but just to understand what their sort of story has been and what's been happening. And often what I find when I take on mediation, people are really stuck. They can't really see a way forward. And I always ask them, what would a good outcome look like? And often we have to do quite a bit of work on that because people become so stuck they can't even see that it's ever going to work. So we look at it future focus. We do talk about the past, but we spend a lot of time talking about the future and what that working relationship would look like. And also do a bit of a reality check to say, what's the worst case scenario? If this doesn't work, what's going to happen? And most of the time people will say, well, I guess one of us will leave. And that's quite, I won't use the word powerful because it's not necessarily a positive, although it could be. Maybe that's the best thing for them, that they do leave the organization. But it's that realization that it has to be resolved one way or the other. And then it's about bringing the two parties together so that they can have a facilitated exchange in a safe environment. And I always encourage people to put everything on the table. Don't leave anything out, because you want to make sure that at the end of the mediation session, you've said everything. And then at the end, if there's a 90% success rate with mediation, if parties are willing to participate, there is a 90% success rate. So I always say to people, it's worth a shot. The success rate is usually quite good. So most of the time we're able to reach an agreement that both parties can then sign up to. And then I do a check-in with them also, because I will say to people, what's going to be different tomorrow? Forget about, for the moment, a month's time or a year's time, but what's going to be different between you guys tomorrow? When you go into work, what's going to be different? So try and get them to think about some practical steps, as well as some sort of medium-term and long-term goals. So that's what mediation looks like. I don't keep any notes. I destroy everything afterwards. So there's no record, because anything that's discussed in mediation, as you probably know, it can't be used in any future grievance or any future dispute. And yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I don't go back to the client and tell them what's been discussed. Often the client will ask. but I don't reveal. That's confidential between me and the parties.
I think you're absolutely right on. Yes, the clients will be curious enough to know, oh, what was discussed, was it
Yeah.
resolved, etc. So thank you very much for that detailed breakdown of mediation. And the other aspects of it is investigations. When would a client bring you in for investigations and why?
Yeah, I think if the investigation or the grievance, so usually an investigation is a result of a complaint or a grievance being made by an employee about a situation or a person within the organization. Sometimes, if the grievance is complex or there are multiple allegations within the grievance, or if the grievance involves senior members of the leadership team, or sometimes it can be a smaller organization where they've literally run out of people that could listen to the grievance because they might be involved as a respondent, or they may have already heard part of it in a previous process, or they might have done some mediation, for example, and then they're not really independent and impartial enough to be able to conduct it. So typically it's where the investigation is quite complex, and they may have tried mediation before. And as I mentioned earlier, I always ask the client at the beginning before taking on any investigation whether they've tried mediation, because that will certainly cost less stressful for the parties involved, is quicker than embarking on an investigation. But sometimes the parties don't want to do that, so that's not a possibility. I know we are talking about investigations, but I think often grievance procedures are written in quite an adversarial way. And I know we are bound by the ACAS Code of Practice on Disciplinary and Grievance Procedures, so there has to be some legalese within it. But it would be good if you could have grievance procedures called resolution policies. Because basically a grievance is something, there's a problem in the workplace. The employee, most of the time, just wants that problem resolved. So an investigation, whilst that might be necessary, there may be other avenues to resolve that grievance and get everything back on track again. But sometimes that isn't possible, and it's in those situations where an organisation might need to use an external investigator. And I think, again, little like the mediation, sometimes there aren't people in-house who either have the skill set or the resource in terms of time, or it could be that it would be viewed that they weren't impartial. And as you're probably aware, there's been quite a few employment tribunal cases where the employment tribunals have ruled that the investigation either wasn't thorough enough or it was biased and it wasn't impartial. So by bringing in an external person as an investigator, you're meeting quite a few requirements there in terms of impartiality, independence, and also a skill set and a good working knowledge of the employment legislation. So lots of investigations are around harassment, discrimination, bullying. So a good investigator will have an understanding of what those legal definitions are. So the investigator has to establish, did the conduct happen? And if that conduct did happen, does it meet the threshold for discrimination, harassment, bullying, whatever the complaint has been? So sometimes bringing in someone who's external, who's got that skill set of being able to do that is advantageous to the organisation. And I read a statistic, I don't have the reference for it and I missed it. There's so much, isn't there, that comes at you through social media. But I did read a statistic that 70% of investigation reports end up in tribunals. So if you're running an investigation, you want to make sure that report is robust and is going to stand up to scrutiny, because it will be somebody's job on the other side to tear it apart. That's just an occupational hazard.
The key to it is the independence and the thoroughness, isn't it? If you conduct an investigation independently and you are very thorough, it's more likely than not that your report itself, yes, it may be subject to scrutiny later on, but it's less likely that it won't get criticized because you've done what you need to do. However, like everything else, employers, business leaders, etc., sometimes seek to influence reports, they seek to influence investigations and things. And that is where sometimes things do go wrong. And that is one of the values or the benefits of engaging an independent consultant, because they come in, they've got no internal ties, or they've got no reason why they shouldn't be impartial. So they can come in fresh pair of eyes with their skills, expertise, experience, and thoroughly investigate that piece of case or that case or work or whatever, write a very decent independent report that whoever is then chairing, whether it's a grievance, whether it's disciplinary, or whatever workplace dispute that gave rise to that investigation, can look at objectively to be able to say, right, okay, these are the findings and these are the actions that I'm going to take as a result of that.
And I think that's an important point that you make there, because I often, well, not, yeah, I sometimes, but not often, sometimes get asked to make a recommendation, but anyone who's doing an investigation, whether they're doing that in-house, then, or they're doing it externally, there needs to be some really clear blue water between the findings of an investigation and what happens as a result. And as an independent investigator, or an investigator in-house, actually, they shouldn't be making any disciplinary decisions or any decisions whether or not to uphold the grievance, because it does need to be a separate process, and there needs to be, as I say, some clear blue water between those two processes. So by appointing someone independently, you're making you're creating that distance. And I think sometimes if you're doing an investigation in-house, people will believe, rightly or wrongly, that there's been some influence there and it was a done deal before the outcome was reached. And sometimes I do get clients ask me mid-investigation, "Oh, what's your opinion? What do you think? Is it going to be a finding or not? Are you going?" And it's really difficult, because this business of thoroughness, sometimes your view can change, because as you collect more evidence, there's more evidence weighted either before it tips the balance, literally. So I sometimes have to push back to clients to say, I can't make any findings until I've completed the process.
Absolutely. And that is very common and it happens all the time. But what do you think the likely outcome of this investigation is going to be? What do you think the likely outcome of this, whatever? And the answer, when you start it, as you've rightly said, is actually, I don't know, because you need to go in with an open mind to really look at the facts around the case for you to be able to decide, yes, these are the findings that either support or don't support the investigations that you are conducting. So that
and it changes throughout the course of the investigation. There's a little bit more. When you first interview the you first interview the person who's making the complaint, the complainant, if you just based your decision on that, well, of course, you're going to find in their favour. When you interview the respondent who gives you a different story, then you've got to weigh up on the balance of probability what actually happened, and you might be using witness statements, written evidence, documentation. So all of that has to be taken into account.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, so we're going to look at value in terms of the services. So we talked about coaching, we talked about mediations and investigations. And what value do you actually bring to your clients, or can HR and people consultants who deliver similar services to yourself bring to their clients?
I think there's the sort of thread that's been running through our conversation today is around this impartiality and independence. And I think if you've got a situation, because all these situations that either lead to maybe someone needing some coaching around managing conflict in their team or their working environment, or somebody maybe thinking about mediation as a way of resolving a grievance, or whether it's I want my grievance investigated fully. You are dealing with people in varying degrees of stress. And again, I think bringing in somebody who's not emotionally involved with it helps. And there's that impartiality as well of being able to listen to everybody's side of the story, because everyone will have a different side and you've just got to weigh up. So I think the value for employers, organizations, is the independence and impartiality and the ability to deal with stressful situations as quickly and as efficiently and as effectively as possible.
Excellent.
So I would say that's the value add. And I think if all organizations thought about mediation before investigations, it's not always possible. If you've got a really serious allegation of maybe harassment, sexual harassment or racial harassment, that may not lend itself to mediation. And it may well be that you have to have an investigation. But if there are other things that can be mediated, that is a far better approach and far more cost-effective way of dealing with a grievance. So I think there's a little bit of value there. And then I think the preventative stuff as well. Often when I speak to clients about grievances, mediation, it's often what I call a distress purchase. They've got a situation, they just want it to go away. But if organizations thought about how do we equip our people to deal with this work world we find ourselves living in now, with all the things that I talked about earlier about 5 generations in the workplace, working remotely, working hybrid, living in this unstable, crazy world that we're in, that's heightened mental health issues, all the things that we know that are in the workplace that perhaps weren't there. Well, they probably were there when I started off work, but no one talked about them.
Didn't get as much attention, absolutely.
Yeah, I think if organizations could equip people better so that there were not, it's a perfect world, I know, maybe I'm being a bit utopian, but if people had a better skill set of being able to deal with difference, I think that may reduce the number of situations where, so I think some value there of being a bit more proactive as well and thinking about it. And I'm sure you've come across it in your HR career. Managers are often promoted because they are fantastic at the job that they do, but that promotion often comes with line management responsibility, and there is very little training often given to them to be able to deal with managing people, and that is sometimes when it goes wrong.
Absolutely. Now, very quickly, are there any lessons learned?
From my experience, yeah, act promptly. As an HR director, and I can see this now when I go into organizations as an independent HR consultant, you can often see how a situation started and you think, oh, it could have been prevented so easily with some early intervention. So my top tip, if you feel that there's a bit of a grumble going on, deal with it quickly. And I often liken it when I'm coaching managers, because managers will go, oh, that's going to be a difficult conversation. And we give ourselves all sorts of reasons why we don't want to have a difficult conversation. I'll wait until I come back off holiday. Oh, Christmas is coming up. Or I'll just wait until this deal is closed. We'll just wait until we've had our conference or whatever it is. It's an excuse.
Absolutely, absolutely. We all prolong and procrastinate on things that we don't enjoy, we find difficult, we're avoiding for whatever reason. Yeah, just.
So I always say to people, and I was doing in fact, I dealt with a grievance that got really messy, and the business owner said to me, I knew this guy, I shouldn't have recruited him. And it just was bad from day one, but he didn't do anything about it. And I said, you know what? This is a really expensive lesson. You're not going to do this again. Because you'll remember that if you want to take out a stinging nettle, it's easier to take it out when it's a little one. When it gets to be a big one, it's going to sting you. So top tip, early intervention. And also, I think the other thing that I find surprising, but does happen, as soon as an organization employer receives a grievance, they sometimes panic and go straight to defense mode, maybe an investigation. But sometimes just ask the person what they would like to happen, because it could be a really easy thing to resolve. I had a client, I've had this a couple of times actually, but one particular client, there was a situation, sort of colleagues were falling out about issues, there was some working style differences, and the employee went to the manager and said, I'm not very happy about whoever, and this has been said, and they went, oh well, you have to put all that in writing and raise a grievance, rather than, oh, I'm really sorry that you've been going through that, what would you like to happen, what can we do to resolve it? So it's just turning those conversations around, and I see that a lot. So those would be a couple of my top tips. And yeah, think about mediation, because it's less expensive. I'm cannibalizing my own work, but that's because I truly believe that mediation is a lot easier than doing bringing in someone to do a workplace investigation.
Excellent. Right. Thank you very much, Liz, for joining us.
Mary,
Thank you for your honesty around what you do, the services you provide for your clients, and the value that the services, that is coaching, investigation, and mediation especially, bring to your client. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed our conversations. If you have any topics that you'd like us to talk about, please do get in touch at hrvoices@hrindependence.co.uk. Thank you. Speak to you or see you again soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity, Mary. It's been fun. Thank you.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of HR Voices. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover or would like to be a guest, we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media or email us at hrvoices@hrindependence.co.uk. Tune in next time.